Hello, hello, hello. So good morning, good morning. My name is George Linares. I am CMS's Chief Technology Officer, so welcome to this month edition of Tech Topics. There's a lot of things happening, so you're going to see me run out of the room after this, but I'll come right back. So I'm trying to multitasking here as much as I can for the benefit, really, for everyone here. More things to come. So today, we have some exciting things. We got Section 508. I know that one of the things I've always asking all of the vendors, right, that they come to see me. And I'm right now in the middle of vendor week, actually, where we call it vendor week because that was my initial thinking that in a week I could meet with 10 vendors, but it just did not happen. So it happens across 3 weeks maybe. And I tried to make the time for all the vendors. But one of the things that I'm always asking is all the presentation materials being sent to CMS, they need to be Section 508. If they are not, I can still take them in, but I cannot share them. Because then the onus is on me to make them Section 508 compliant. So if you make them Section 508 compliant, then I can share them freely across the agency. So Section 508 really is very important. I tell that to the vendors. Some vendors, they put the extra effort and they do it, and it's fantastic because it makes my job that much easier to share the information. And that's what hopefully you see that's the trend. I'm trying to be as transparent with the information, try to share across the agency, try to bring collaboration, cooperation on what I see and some of the initiatives and some of the requirements that are sort of are coming up of the different things that CMS is trying to do. So Section 508 is very important. Aaron, it's going to be remote. He is one of our, Aaron, are you on the line? Hello, Aaron? Aaron?
Different. And even if you stay, you can't.
Aaron, are you on the line?
I was like, I know that you don't probably know it, but it comes across.
Hello?
Hello?
Aaron?
I'm here.
Oh, okay, perfect. So Aaron Allen, he's our Section 508 officer. You may not see him, but he's watching you, all right? He's there. He sees all the documents, but he is our conduit to the department. As you know, Section 5 and Section 504 for us are very important. So that's why I wanted to share some of the new things that are happening. And then Aaron's going to be sharing some of those things. After that, it's going to be the Office of Communication on their agile implementation. We're doing that more and more, and we're trying to make the tools, we're doing some internal discussions to make those tools more readily available to the contractor and CMS community. So we're trying to make them more enterprise ready. And then on the last piece, the eligibility and enrollment, this is the ELMO effort. This is a huge effort. We're talking about migrating Model 204 systems. They're still around here. And for what I understand, Australia is the other country that has Model 204 in production. And we're trying to really move away from that. This is a huge effort on what we're going and some of the potentials that system brings up. It should be, and all of you will benefit from knowing this information because you get access to a lot of the Medicare Part A, B, and C, and D that we have. So without any delay, I'm going to turn it over to you. Aaron, are you good?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Yes, my name is Aaron Allen. I am with the Office of Information Technology, and I'm going to be talking today briefly on the new Section 508 refresh. Today's information that I'm going to provide is just an overview. It's designed to give you more of an awareness that this is here. It is coming to be what the new requirements and status is for Section 508 for not only CMS, but throughout the entire federal government. Okay, I have slide 1 up, please. This is our introduction slide. If we go to slide 2. Okay, now here we have the original Section 508 standards information. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of history and background on this information of how we got to where we are now. In 2010, we had the proposed rule released. In January of this year, the rule was released for publication and had been finalized. And it takes effect January 18th of 2018. So this is just our background timeline of how we got to where we are from the original rule of 2008. Okay, can we go to slide 3, please? Now, I wanted to give you guys an idea. For many of you who are very familiar with 508, you're familiar with how the standards are laid out. And I want to give you an idea of how they are because the change is so significant. The current VPAT layout, you have your application, you have your applicable sections, and your designation of that number related to this applicable section. So we have hardware, we have software, we have desktop computers, we have web, and other applications and standalone. And we also have our functional performance criteria and documentation. Can we go to the next slide, please? Again, I said this is looking very familiar to everyone, as if you're familiar with completing a Section 508 VPAT, or if you're familiar with any of the standards of how they're currently laid out. For CMS, Sections 1194.31, 1194.41 were always required to be completed by the vendor or developer so that we're able to assess the compliance levels of applications. Well, that's changing significantly. Now let's go to the next slide. Okay, the new Section 508 refresh breaks down the standards not into the subsections that we saw before or that we see presently on the PAT, but into chapters. We have chapters which define, and within each chapter, we define what guidelines are required to be met for applications to be considered compliant. We have Chapter 1, which is general administration. Chapter 2, which is scoping requirements. Chapter 3 is now functional performance criteria. Chapter 4 and 5, which are hardware and software. Chapter 6 is the criteria needed for support documentation and services. And Chapter 7 is reference standards. Now, reference standards refer to how a lot of the Section 508 requirements refer to something called the WCAG standards, Web Council Accessibility Standards. And that will be explained later. Let me pause by saying that a lot of the information is still coming out and it's being posted on the section508.gov website. And I strongly urge all of you to look at the links that we're providing here. Go to that website, maybe weekly, because information is becoming released on a weekly basis, and that way you'll have the most up-to-date information. Since we have created these slides, new relevant information has already been posted for this week that is not included in this slide material. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, the importance of going to look at this slide, the information of the linked material, is that HHS has chosen to implement the new Section 508 refresh beginning January 1st, 2018. They are advising all optives and statives within HHS to do so. Now, what that means is that beginning January 1st, 2018, we will be looking for any new applications, hardware, software, combination of applications, systems, to be conforming to the new Section 508 refresh standards. Anything that's under development now, that's just on paper in the design phase, should be designing to the new standards. Anything that's past the design phase meaning prototypes are available, or testing has begun. Any of those development efforts will follow under what's called the safe harbor provision, and I'll talk more about that as we go on. But I just wanted to give information to everyone to know that, this is here. This is what we're looking for beginning January 2018. But if you have something that's in the works or in the mill, as they say now, the safe harbor provision would mean for you it must be meeting the Section 508 compliance standards as they stand today. Anything that's developed on or after January 1st, 2018, implemented, must meet the new refresh standards as outlined by GSA, which is located at section508.gov website. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. I should say slide 7 for you guys. Now, I want to walk through a little bit of this based on my understanding, because there's still a lot of learning that is going on both internally and externally throughout the industry about Section 508, the refresh. The new guidance is established to provide guidance based on the features and functionality of the application, not so much the application type. For example, in the past we were looking at software just as software, 1194-22 and its software requirements. Now we're looking at what are the features of that software, what functions are incorporated into that software. Does that software work specifically with a piece of hardware? For example, think of apps where you could have a piece of software on a mobile device, but it's specially designed to work and engage with that mobile device in its operating environment. We're looking at, Section 508 is looking at the features and functionality of those type of software and hardware combinations for its overall compliance. So there's more scrutiny on the overall functionality of software and hardware applications and how they work together and how they both can be accessible for people with disabilities together. The smartphone with their apps are two separate entities, if you think of that way, but when you bring them together, they work together as one functioning component with that smartphone. How accessible is that to people with disabilities? Now, the new standards also harmonize accessibility guidelines and work together with international EU standards. There's more clarity on how public-facing and non-public-facing content is to be reviewed. And there's more clarity on how software and operating systems need to work with assistive technologies. A new aspect of Section 508, which to me it is not new, but is being more defined, is that it addresses access for people with cognitive and learning disabilities or language barriers. This really wasn't specified in the previous Section 508 guidelines. Another thing that is being emphasized this go-round is Section 508 is going to be applicable to even the offering tools that are designed to create content. Think of Photoshop. Photoshop itself is a tool that renders content. I can take Photoshop as a tool and render Section 508 content, but the tool itself does not allow me to do so because it itself is not 508 compliant. Now, more scrutiny will be on the tool itself. Can a person with a disability use that tool to create content that is accessible for others with disabilities? That is the mindset of the new Section 508 guidelines. There's more clarity on exceptions also, and that will be more ironed out as more agencies are provided guidance and training on what exceptions will qualify and what criteria are needed for such exceptions. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, this slide talks about testing requirements. I put this slide in here just to give developers, vendors, CMS staff an understanding that beginning January, CMS will be testing against the new WCAG and Section 508 refresh standards. The testing methodology will improve. The testing reports and the results will be more comprehensive and provide more guidance on what areas need to be addressed to bring them into the new refresh conformance. We know that the current reports are kind of scant in the information that they provide, and we're working on acquiring tools and techniques to provide more information to the end user, the business owner, the vendor, developer, so that they are more aware of what areas need to be addressed to bring the applications into compliance. So CMS is actively engaged with vendors who provide such tools and who provide tools that are designed for the new refresh and WCAG standards, and we are moving forward and obtaining a tool that will provide us with both a holistic review of applications as they're being tested and a more comprehensive report that can be broken down to multiple levels for readability and understanding. Okay, the next slide, please. Now, the Section 508 guidelines are broken down into 12 guidelines, basically based on 4 principles. And I wanted to put these principles here because this is the big takeaway. No matter what you're developing, whether it's software, a combination software, hardware, web-based, internal, external, or a combination of all of the above. The 4 basic principles is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And I have this all spelled out here for you. I'm not going to read through all of that. But these are basic guidelines that they're basically, basic principles that they're adhering to with Section 508. The applications have to meet these basic principles to be considered Section 508 compliance under the new guidelines. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, the new standards are mostly referred by reference to the old WCAG 2.0 standard. The WCAG 2.0 standards have been out for, I'm going to say 15 years. The old Section 508 standards were their own subset of standards that did not align with WCAG. That is what the refresh is trying to do. So many of the guidelines and standards are just referencing WCAG 2.0 at this time. I don't know if they're ever going to change to the 2.1 WCAG, which is coming out. That information hasn't been provided to us yet. So much of what Section 508 is aligning themselves is actually what a lot of vendors have already been utilizing. So for many, it will not be a significant shift in how they develop or create content if they were following WCAG in the previously. Okay, if we go to the next slide. Okay, this is just a small comparison table of showing where we are and where we hope to be. Right now, we implement Section 508 standards using the current standard. We review the current VPAT. We look at applications as subset or segments. It's either software or it's hardware or it's web-based. And we review and provide reports based on the current subset standards. We're moving to the more holistic approach, as I mentioned before, of our testing and evaluation. And we will be providing more comprehensive reports as we test the application utilizing the new standards. Now, the testing procedures will not change much. We'll still have an individual who's testing applications using assistive technology, using the state-of-the-art tools and techniques for evaluating content. But in addition to that, we're providing more comprehensive automated reporting across the entire scope of the application to determine if there are any vulnerabilities or deficiencies in the overall Section 508 posture. So it's not just going to give you this user's using JAWS and it's having that difficulty and the tables aren't structured this way. Now we'll be able to give you more of a users of assistive technology may incur issues with tables or may have color contrast related issues or may have difficulty utilizing your site because headers are missing or out of order, that type of thing. The benefit to vendors and developers is that once the analysis is complete, fixes to the application or content will be pretty much easy because the application will have a more global evaluation. The information provided will be more user-friendly and will give you clear guidance as to where to go to get more information either through WCAG or Section 508.gov. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, now here's just a list of resources that we're providing. We have the Access Board, and there's Section 508 new rule, which is posted on the internet now. HHS is posting information about Section 508 in the refresh and what their expectations are and how they plan to incorporate the life cycle process and acquisitions process for evaluation of Section 508 with the upcoming release of the product assessment template that is hoped to come out soon. General Service Administration is your best source. The Section 508.gov website has all of the information. It is now being updated weekly. There's training for developers, training for vendors. There's procurement information now being posted. There's information regarding what requirements need to be met for what content types, and a whole bunch of information regarding new requirements for submission of procurement-related documents such as statement of work and VPAT information. There's also training now being available for procurement officials through GSA. It's listed as new, so I don't know if it's a link there yet, but it is upcoming and available for individuals who are dealing with acquisitions and for technical guidance for vendors and developers. The World Wide Web Consortium is also a great place to go to get more information about the WCAG standards I had mentioned before. since a lot of Section 508 is referencing WCAG, it is not listing those individual standards within the body of the standards themselves. They reference various aspects of both WCAG 2.0 and the Telecommunications Act for guidance on that information. I strongly recommend going to those websites because that information is updated frequently and much more so than information at the government level at this time. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, for questions, you can reach out to the Section 508 mailbox, and that's CMS space section _508 at cms.hhs.gov. If you have questions now, I don't know if time permits for me to answer any, but I'm open for questions if time allows.
Good morning. So thank you, Aaron. This is Lisa Feuerberg. If there are questions in the room, we actually do have time to take some. If you could just walk up to the mic, we can take any of those.
Hey, Aaron, this is Jennifer Govero from CGI. I was wondering, you mentioned HHS is going to release a new version of the PAT hopefully soon. So for vendors who are under development right now, how soon do you anticipate that we should start using the VPAT 2.0 for our submissions?
If you have the VPAT 2.0 as provided by the Industry Council, CMS will accept that document.
Great.
If it's completed correctly. HHS, the time frame for HHS, unfortunately, I could not tell you, Jennifer. I'm being told that it's going to be anywhere from the end of October to maybe the end of the year. But the new VPAT 2.0 is out. If those who wish to use it, especially if you're developing something that's to be released in 2018, you can submit that.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you. So second question was, for the functional performance criteria, you mentioned cognitive and learning disabilities are now covered. I was curious if CMS would be releasing any specific guidance around expectations of techniques or preferences with regards to some of the WCAG techniques in order to meet the revised standards.
Lisa, Jennifer, that's a great question. And all I can say to you as of right now is as we learn more and review the WCAG standards for those definitions, we will be providing developers and vendors with our expectations. It is our hope to work with HHS and develop something that's more departmental-wide for all the expectations, including cognitive and learning disabilities and language barriers, so that we're not putting something out that could be contradicting what FDA or HRSA or CDC is doing.
Right.
So again, I'm asking for patience on that avenue as we work together as a department to provide the type of guidance you're seeking.
Okay, that's great. So third question is, we currently test, when Mario tests for us with IE11 and the latest version of JAWS, are there plans to expand kind of the set of accessibility supported target browsers and AT products, or is that still what CMS is planning to use moving forward?
Well, I can say that we'll be using JAWS for the near future for a long time. As far as browsers, IE11 or the latest IE, whatever version it will be, Chrome, Firefox. If you're testing in those environments, that gives you more of a holistic view, and we support that testing algorithm. As far as what we'll be looking at with the new tool that we hope to implement, it's going to be looking at your application in a more holistic value across multiple platforms. Even though we may have a user using JAWS in IE to test your application, the reports you'll be given will be based on a wide array of assistive technologies and platforms based on your programmatic approach to coding, not your specific targeting of an application in an AT. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that is helpful. So, I mean, it sounds like we'll continue the approach of if we identify something as an AT or user agent bug, it won't necessarily be considered an issue against the application as long as the application is programmatically exposing information through the API.
That is, yes, Jennifer, that's correct.
Perfect. So last question, for the safe harbor provision, you mentioned for applications that are kind of past the design stage and into development or testing, that they would qualify to be tested against the original 508 standards, and anything still in analysis or design stages would need to meet the revised standards. So moving forward a year from now, once we're all fully into the 508 refresh, has any guidance come out yet from HHS or for you guys within CMS in terms of how we'll assess against safe harbor moving forward, since the access board says it's kind of on a component by component basis, meaning if a portion of the page changes, it needs to be assessed against the revised standards. I was just curious, kind of procedurally, how we'll indicate that to you.
It is our plan, it is our thinking that we'll be following the Access Board's guidance on that, and that will be at the department level, meaning if there are any changes to any aspect of the UI of an application going forward. So let's say you release something today, it is under Section 508 standards as they stand. And in March of 2018, you make a change to a page. That new change will be subjected to the new refresh standards. That new UI or changes to any UI on an existing system will be under the new Section 508 refresh standards.
So in terms of indicating that to you in a VPAT, will we just be reporting kind of the meta or the delta of what is considered under the revised standards versus the original standards?
And for the interim,
Okay.
because it's our hope to get everyone to the new standards, and we know and we understand that with development and time frames and budgets and how projects are laid out in scope and implemented, this is going to be a time-consuming process for everyone. And as always, Jennifer, I'm sure you're aware, we are always flexible and are willing to work with developers in how they implement. Because for us, the main focus is to provide accessibility to all of our end users for applications or systems or documents that we can. We provide such a large, valuable service to the United States public that having applications as accessible as possible has always been my mindset. With that, we'll always be willing to work with vendors and developers on moving toward 508 compliance as progress. We're not looking for perfection, we're looking for progress. So as you move in your development efforts, each phase should be thinking of the new refresh and having that in mind. If you're revisiting, or if you're any developer revisiting current content and having to do any UI changes, should be programming for the future. And we will be willing to have discussions, as to how timetables can be laid out, the best method, the best mechanism. Section 508 is more concept now than it has been before. As you can see, if we're adhering to the principles, the 4 principles I've described, then we're moving in the right direction. We're making that progress that is needed to get to the compliance level that makes your application usable, to the majority of users. And that's what our mindset is.
Thanks, Aaron. That's great. Appreciate the time.
No problem.
Jennifer, thank you for those questions. That was really good conversation. We have another question, Aaron?
Hi, this is John Gondapati from FEI Systems. So my question is towards web applications. So we have the assets framework, which helps us develop UI components that are Section 5.8 compliance that is provided by CMS. Is there a plan to make the new assets framework compliant to the VPAT 2.0? And is there a roadmap towards that? Hello?
I want to apologize. I didn't fully understand the question.
Okay, so the UI component framework assets, there is a framework which we use to develop web UI elements. So are you going to update the UI elements to the VPAT 2.0, and when would that be?
So I think, Aaron, what I heard was, are there plans to update the UI component of development for the VPAT 2.0?
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
Well, the VPAT 2.0 document, which is released, will be distributed. I don't know about the UI element for what you're speaking of, and we'll have to review that. So to answer your question, as of right now, if there are changes that need to be made, we will move forward on making them. We're just learning more about the new VPAT 2.0 that's been released. It is no longer in beta. We're learning what HHS's plan is for implementing, if they're going to revise that VPAT for the HHS umbrella, or if they're going to leave that as the same. And we're learning how that impact is going to impact CMS with all of its various avenues: procurement, development, maintenance, and all of those areas. So I don't have a yes/no answer for you, but we will be evaluating all of these aspects and moving toward addressing them with the proper resources once we know more.
So towards that, one suggestion is the framework I'm talking about is called assets.cms.gov. It's a UI framework. So if you could make it like GitHub repository where vendors could check in the code and contribute towards this, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so you're talking about something called asset.framework.gov?
Assets.cms.gov.
Assets.cms.gov. Okay. We will look at that. If that needs to be modified, we will modify that by moving it to the new HHS VPAT 2.0.
Thank you.
Once the HHS VPAT 2.0 is released, that is. I know that there's much discussion on what direction it's going in. So when it's available, we will be we'll look at that website and make the modification.
And it looks like our next presenter actually can address that question. But before we get to that, are there any questions on the phone?
If there are any questions at this time, please do so by using the raise hand feature, and your lines will be unmuted individually.
No hands?
At this time, we have no questions in the queue.
Okay, thank you. So we're running just a tad over, so I'd like to introduce the next presenter. Aaron, before we go, Can you reiterate that email address for people to use if they have questions that they want to ask you that maybe weren't addressed here?
Sure. That address is section underscore or underline 508 at cms.hhs.gov. If you have questions, please feel free to send them to that email address. We will address them as best we can. I want to thank you all for attending and for your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. All right, I'd like to introduce our next presenter. John Booth from the Office of Communications is up here to talk about, or is joining us to talk about tools and strategies that they use with the CMS public websites. Thank you, John.
All right, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here today. So, yeah, what I wanted to talk about is, some of our priorities and just put out to you guys some of the things we're thinking about. The title of the presentation was Tools to Improve Velocity and Quality, and we are, sort of facing more and more, work, more and more requests, a desire to really improve citizen self-service, allowing people to do more and more online. And a desire to really sort of measure user satisfaction and demonstrate that we're building services that people are able to use successfully. And so, those are the goals. The challenges, we face an increasing workload. There's an expectation that there's sort of a faster time to market on everything that we're building, that we can do things more quickly. And we're in a world where there's sort of changing citizen expectations around government services. There's sort of a sea change, and what people can do in the private sector and on commercial websites, they expect that they can start to do those things on government websites as well. So what we really are trying to look at is we need to address those challenges, we need to tackle them and be able to demonstrate that we can meet these goals. So we're looking at ways that we can continuously improve, and so we're sort of focused on three areas. The process that we use, the tools that we have that support those process, and then the skills that our teams, and that team is globally, it's our staff and our contractor teams. So what we've got up here is a slide that I'm calling our radar, and I've got a link. This is a concept that we took from ThoughtWorks, and ThoughtWorks puts out a quarterly radar. It's got tons and tons of things on there, and it's sort of things you should really be in the process of implementing, things you should be looking at, maybe some things you should sort of be abandoning, some ideas that the market tried and really didn't succeed. And so we've looked at something like this to help us prioritize work out of a long list of things that we need to do. And so I'm going to run through a couple of these just to give you a sense of some of where we're prioritizing our team's time and our resources. One thing I did just want to mention, our team has spent a lot of time over the last year. Team took a look at a book called The Phoenix Project, which is a novel that Gene Kim wrote about a team sort of struggling with the DevOps transformation. We looked at the DevOps handbook, and there's a book that I actually just got a chance to read from the 80s called The Goal, and it kind of inspired the Phoenix Project, and it's in a manufacturing context rather. And it was just kind of interesting to me because actually I found both of the books that were DevOps centric very informative, but reading it in a manufacturing context, it actually sort of had some light bulbs click for me, because kind of like reading it in somebody else's world and challenges I don't face. So anyways, I think a big theme of all of those books is what are the roadblocks in our process? Where are things getting bottlenecked? And when we address those bottlenecks, when we fix those, what are we going to find next? And so you sort of have to have this continuous improvement methodology, because once you fix a set of problems, you're going to kind of surface the next set of problems and being prepared to tackle those. So I'll run through a couple of these. Just again, these are a couple of key things I wanted to bring up and highlight that we are prioritizing. And this for us is sort of the next, as we're into a new fiscal year, these are a couple of our priorities that we're spending a lot of time on. So the biggest to me, the one I'm actually probably most excited about on this whole list, is using feature flag-based development. And this is something we've been doing for a while, but we've been doing in little kind of like snowflake ways across every team. And to the point about bottlenecks earlier, one of the things that we've seen is we have to sort of find systemic or repeatable ways to address these problems. We can't have every sort of team tackle these things their own way. So we're moving forward with a platform called Launch Darkly that will have sort of on-premise in our AWS environment that will let us build new features and applications behind feature flags. And what that's going to enable us to do is really sort of completely decouple the release of code out to production from the launch of a feature. Because what happens in our world today is we get something built, it's ready to go, somebody maybe finds a data quality issue or finds a bug in that code, and we sort of have to put the brakes on the whole entire thing. And that's really, really disruptive, especially if you have a couple releases sort of bunched up together. And so for us, this is very exciting because it's just going to enable that. The developers, once code is done, it's passed all of its testing, whether those are automated or manual, that code can go out. And it is our product owner's responsibility. We move sort of responsibility for the launch of a feature from a development team to a product owner deciding with the business that that feature is actually ready to be live. So again, we're very, very excited to get that out there. Just a little bit about sort of the layout of this. I've kind of put our top priorities at the top in a bigger and darker font, and then as we sort of go down the list, you'll see things that we are paying attention to, but maybe not a little less than the ones at the top. So the next one at the top is sort of journey mapping and service design, and this is another big priority for us. We tend to build lots of tools on lots of websites, and we've traditionally built those things in sort of a siloed fashion. And what we really want to do is, as we're getting requests to build new things, or as we're getting requests to build new features in existing tools, is to figure out who those users are, how that feature or that tool fits in their workflow, how it relates to everything else, where they would use it, the context they would use it, and make sure that we're building things that sort of fit in with the overall priorities of our websites and our sort of vision for customer service in the future. So again, this is an area we're trying to get our team spending a lot of time on. We're doing some work right now in diagramming those journey maps for some of our systems. As a beneficiary comes into Medicare.gov, you know, what is it they want to do? What steps do they have to go to get to it? And even going, you know, we're going a little bit, you know, we're thinking sort of from a customer service perspective. In our world today, there are things that beneficiaries can only do by the phone, can only do through mail, can only do online in a few cases, and we really want to think about, like, when we're launching things and when we're thinking about the customer service journey, really we should provide options for people to be able to do those things through the channel that is most, that they're most comfortable with, and we should also allow people to kind of channel shift if you start online and you need to move to the phone and vice versa. So again, that's a big focus. There's a lot of work that's been happening across CMS on implementing Lean, and sort of that journey mapping process is really critical to Lean. So we saw some good examples on sort of internal, how CMS work is being done internally, and we're taking that and applying that to sort of our customer service channels. I've got a couple API items here. We're very much focused on sort of doing API first development. Number one, that allows us to sort of decouple the front ends more loosely. That actually enables some of the feature flag development I talked about earlier. But it also enables us to expose those APIs and let other people do things with them that we either haven't gotten to yet, or that maybe aren't a priority for us, or things that are just sort of interesting in a commercial context but not in a government context. Again, in our world, we run the agency's public websites, so we sort of have the stuff that we're building through APIs is almost exclusively stuff that is not, you know, that we can make accessible to the public. So we're looking to do more and more of that. Related to that is the bullet underneath, which is, you know, we want to make sure that we have a good approach for rolling those APIs out. So we've stood up an API gateway. I've mentioned this at a couple other meetings, but we're using an open source tool called Kong for our API gateway. We've had a lot of success with that. We're in the process, actually, I think we're just very shortly away from launching a developer portal. And that really for us means a couple different things. The first is we want to, these public APIs we're making available, we really are open to anybody using them, but we're looking to issue access keys or tokens so that we can sort of track who's using them and why, and actually get some analytics on those APIs. APIs that we've launched in the past couple of years that we didn't do that. Again, it's great, people are out there using them. We have no visibility into who's using them and why, and are they using it right. And so we really want to have access to those analytics and sort of see who's using them, be able to measure which ones are a success and which ones might need some work. So that's one aspect. We sort of have this self-service capability for people to issue API keys and get started using our APIs right away. But the other aspect of that is CMS has tons of resources out there. We have APIs, we have data sets, various things. They're scattered across 1,000 different channels, and it's very, if you're very, very invested in our world, you can find all the developer resources we have. But I've always said we don't make it easy for people. So the developer portal will pull all those things into sort of a single place. It might launch you out to other places, but you'll get a sense of the data sets that we have available, the APIs we have available. Related to that, I'll jump over to the other column. So there was a question earlier about assets.cms.gov. That was a product or a project we launched a couple of years ago when we redesigned the cms.gov website, and we pulled together a bunch of CSS assets, HTML files, JavaScript libraries, all those sorts of things. So that's been out there for a couple of years. We just a couple of weeks ago launched a project called Design System. So I've got the URL up here. It's design.cms.gov is the URL. That one actually is launched on GitHub. So from the very start, we launched that as an open source project. We have had some developers come in and give us some pull requests against there, which is awesome. That's sort of a more modern framework. So that uses React, which is an open source UI library, as the underlying framework. That's really just sort of the code that you can build a website on. It's not so much the look and feel. Assets.cms.gov is a little bit of both the code you would use and some of the look and feel. What we're trying to do is sort of launch site-specific style guides on top of design.cms.gov. So we have a healthcare.gov style guide. We'll be looking to do the same thing for Medicare.gov and for the CMS.gov website. So that's a project I would recommend people look at. And we are looking at the 508 presentation earlier was great. We're very sort of invested in that work and looking at the impacts for our work. So we'll look at both the assets framework and the design system for the new 508 standards. The last one in sort of the top quadrant of our page, we've really moved forward to so we've designed our work. We've got 2-week sprints. 3 of those 2-week sprints are bundled up into program increments, or 4 weeks into program increments. So we have 8 of those a year. We're really trying to work with our internal research resources as well as those of our development teams to sort of build user research into each of those program increments so that as we are building products, we're getting user feedback on that. We're never sort of launching something out into production and saying like, no user can figure out how to use this. How did that happen? And so we're going to continue over the next 12 months to really sort of like integrate that as a core part of our project process. But we've seen a lot of good success out of that so far. The next sort of tier for us, again, these are things that are sort of like important, but maybe not having as many resources applied to them. The first one is sort of related to the API gateway, and so we're trying to stand up mock API services so that if somebody is exploring building something against one of our APIs, they may not be sure if it's right for them, if it has the data that they need, that there's sort of a playground where they can interact with test data probably before issuing an actual API key and sort of building a production system. So again, those are some features that are offered through the developer portal that we're standing up and looking to get more of those in place. We're also looking to move sort of all of our development teams and all of our DevOps teams to a blue-green deployment model. And we just talked in a briefing a couple of weeks ago about the fact that we're no longer really, in the cloud environment, our systems are all run in AWS at this point. We're really no longer doing code deployments, we are doing server deployments. So our systems, when we do a code deployment, we are standing up new VMs with the latest application code on them. We'd use some smoke testing to validate that that's gone well, and then we'd sort of turn the old set of servers off. So that really sort of changes the way you can come at deployments, and you can do them during peak times, actually. You don't need to do those sort of things overnight when nobody's on the system. So again, we've had some really good successes there, but looking to just sort of formalize that and make that standard across the board. We've also been doing a couple of experiments or beta tests, if you will, with bringing some SaaS tools, software as a service tools, on-premise and having vendors manage those. So the feature flag platform I mentioned earlier, launched darkly, is one example of that. We're doing a couple of others, and we've learned a lot. I think in that the SaaS vendors we're working with have learned a lot. So that's a model we're looking to get to a place where we can sort of replicate that and make that a repeatable process. We're also standing up a tool called Screen Door, which is an on-premise forms sort of a data collection and workflow tool that's a similar sort of model there. We've also been experimenting or doing proofs of concept over the last 12 months around containers and orchestration and service discovery. So we've done a lot of work with Docker and other containerization technologies. And I think we're at the point where we're going to begin rolling some things out onto there. Again, the goal there is that will make a lot of this, stuff easier. The blue-green deployment sort of thing just becomes even easier, even more automatable in a container framework than it is today, where we're working at the VM level. And then my sort of last tier here, a couple other things we are working on. We've been doing a number of pilots of Let's Encrypt. So Let's Encrypt is a certificate authority. It's an open source one. It's free. Basically, it enables you to sort of automate the process of issuing SSL certs, and the certs are good for 90 days, so as opposed to the commercial certs, which are a year or more. Let's Encrypt, again, lets you build sort of an automated pipeline, an automated deployment pipeline for deploying your certs and keeping them up to date and refreshing them. And again, as we have more and more servers, VMs, containers, all of those things talking over SSL, the number of certs that we are managing is just on a curve straight up for our team. And so we're excited about this as a possible way for removing some of that manual process we have in place today. We've also, and this sort of ties into the API topic earlier, we launched on healthcare.gov in 2013 a content API. We published all of our content out not only as HTML, but as JSON, and so other sites could consume that. We want to we want to sort of build on what was state of the art in 2013 and modernize that, get those content APIs behind the API gateway and publish their visibility and availability and get those out there, and really sort of set that as a standard for the public websites that if we're publishing content, we're publishing it not only for ourselves, but for third parties to use. And then we're also looking to implement translation APIs so that as we generate content more frequently, we can, again, automate that translation pipeline and get the content out with Spanish or other languages more quickly than we have been able to in the past, and to really kind of launch English and Spanish and any other languages in parallel so that those things aren't sort of staggered launches. And then two other topics. Authenticated web chat is something that we've done on mymedicare.gov for a number of years. We've piloted it in a couple other places. This is something we're looking to expand the use of. This sort of gets back to journey mapping it again, the idea of that sort of channel shift, and maybe this is even the opposite of that. What we want is if somebody's on the website and we can sort of finish that transaction out on the website by getting maybe one question that they have answered. Let's not have them close their browser and pick up the phone and make a call. Let's have them talk to a CSR through web chat and sort of finish that transaction out. So we're very excited to look at some opportunities where we can deploy that more broadly than we have in the past. And then, bug bounties, security is something that is just more and more a topic we're looking at every single day. We've got our sites protected behind a variety of things, but we continue to see people sort of trying to hit our sites and find vulnerabilities and those sorts of things. We've definitely watched the work that other agencies have done, DoD and Homeland Security and other agencies have done some really innovative stuff with bug bounty programs. So that's something that we're looking at as well to see if we could maybe do a pilot of that on one of the public websites. So I think with that, I will stop. Again, that's a little flavor of some of the things that we are looking at and, sort of paying attention to over the next 12 months. I think I'll stop there, and we can go ahead and see if there's any questions either in the room or on the phone. Yep.
Hey, John, good morning.
Hey, good.
Hi, I'm Quintus Brown with Half Acre.
Yep.
Just a couple of quick questions. So with open enrollment coming up, it's a tenuous time. So how have you incorporated lessons learned from previous open enrollments to kind of improve the citizen experience for this upcoming open enrollment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, we have both Marketplace and Medicare open enrollment kind of hit us in a big wave. I think on the Medicare side, there's maybe two examples I would give. One is that last year, there were a couple of data elements we sort of took out of the site because it didn't look like people were using them. And, it might have been a small number of users, but those were sort of very important. And so we did some work this year, not only to bring those data elements back, but we actually incorporated the user research that I mentioned. So we came up with some mock-ups and wireframes, sat down with some users, and so we've added that data back, but we've added it back in a way that we've sort of been able to demonstrate is more useful than it was last year. So that's one example. I think on the technical side, we've made a number of changes to sort of the underlying technologies to make it more scalable. We're in AWS for this open enrollment. We're doing a lot more with AWS auto scaling than we have in years past. And so as we were doing performance testing, I think it was 2 weeks ago, it was really cool. We did a test on one of our systems, and we started the test off with a small number of servers. And the test began, and right away the CPU spiked up to 100%. And what you saw is like 4 minutes later, the systems were back down to 50% because at that point, let's say it was on 2 before, 4 minutes later it was running on 8 servers. And then over time you saw the test scale down, and the test ended and the system scaled itself back down to 2 servers. It was like magic.
Nice, yeah.
And we first looked at the results and we were like, that's really bad that you spiked up to 100%, but that's sort of the condition that then triggers the auto scaling to take effect. So that was a great sort of learning opportunity for us.
Okay, great. One other quick question. A lot of citizens have expressed challenges with like getting through the entire process on any enrollment opportunity. So how are you collecting that user data from those citizens that have those challenges to inform what you do in journey mapping and your service design?
Sure. So probably 3 things I would talk about. I think one is the user research, and some of that we actually do with real consumers. We will sit down and be with somebody side by side as they actually go through an enrollment, so you can sort of get their feedback. And that's data we get to the development teams right away so they can act on it. Second is, I think we've put a lot of analytics into the tools now, more than we've ever had before. And we're doing more of that this year on the Medicare side than we have in years past. So for example, in Medicare Plan Finder, we can see now, there's a question around what sort of coverage do you currently have? Are you in Medicare Advantage? Are you in Original Medicare? There's one answer on there, which is, I don't know. Lots of people are answering, I don't know. So as we see that, like we think there's something wrong with that question. We might need some help there. We might need something that describes those terms that we've got on the page. We might need to change the terms on the page. So that's an example. Yeah, those are probably the 2 that come to mind. Yeah.
That's fine. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right.
With the API first development, we are a small portal inside Enterprise Portal. So for the front end, at the enterprise level, you have Enterprise Portal that acts as a gateway. Do you have any plans to create an enterprise level API gateway like a PG or 3Scale, any enterprise level which a small portal like us could integrate with and just have a self-subscribing API in there?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely something we're talking about in CMS to figure out, which things that CMS is building should sort of be like enterprise shared services with a capital E, and then which are things that it makes sense for teams to sort of stand up. The one thing I'll say about our API gateway that we've stood up is sort of from a security posture, the way we've audited it, is it's basically configured for public APIs. So when we issue API keys, anybody can come and request one. So we're not doing that sort of like identity verification, I would say. We're not doing any APIs where we would need to know that this person is, is such and such, nor are we doing anything where the person might need to come back like every 6 months, every 12 months, and like validate that they need access the way you would do through like the EUA system. There are other teams that are building APIs that need that sort of level of security, so we're sort of talking to them about what the right approach is on those things. But definitely, kind of all the things I've talked through here, we're having lots of discussions in CMS about kind of how they fit in with CMS's shared services strategy.
And talking about the feature flag-based development, so I'm not familiar with the LiveDarkly, so I assume it's just an isolation of beta users with a smaller scale with newer features released onto a parallel environment. So how different is it?
That's right. So there's a whole number of criteria you can use to launch based on. So you could launch to users in a geographic region. You could launch to a percentage of users. You could launch to users on a certain platform, let's say a browser, an operating system combination. So you can sort of decide what those criteria are for launching. Our most common use case, I think there's two. One is that when we, even when we have something ready to go and there's no sort of issues with launching it, we have seen, I think, nothing but upside from a phased launch. So last year when we were launching the new Plan Compare 2.0 system for the marketplace, what we did is we first started with getting some call center users online, making sure they could use it, a subset of them, then we rolled it out to more of the call centers. We started to bring consumers on, ramp that up, and so by the time we got to 100% on both of those, we felt very confident. The other use case I mentioned earlier is, we just want to have that sort of control point so that if even something's technically ready, it's all good to go, but that for the business, there's a business reason that it can't be launched, you're sort of holding it behind those feature flags. So those are our two primary use cases for the platform.
Thank you.
Thanks.
My question, John, is on the same lines. The API-based development, what is the initiative that you have right now that forces the new app development teams to adopt this? So that's question number one. Question number two is, what happens to the legacy apps? How do we API enable them? Is there an initiative going on to do that as well?
Yeah, no, those are good questions. So I think inside of OC for our development teams, we've sort of collaborated with them to develop a set of API, I don't know if I would call them standards or guidelines, but we've sat down with everybody and said, here are the things that we want to do through API-based development, and gotten feedback from the teams and sort of get agreement from everybody that those are the standards that we'll use. And so again, in our world, mostly consumer use of our APIs, we're basically across the board using JSON as the delivery mechanism, and again, that was something we worked through with the teams. From the legacy perspective, we have set that standard for the new development moving forward. For other systems, we're sort of looking at when we might have a window to be doing maintenance on it for other reasons, and at that point looking if it would make sense to add an API. The other thing that we've done is, so for a lot of the legacy apps we have that have not been rewritten to sort of be API first, for years now we've put data out. We use Socrata as our sort of open data platform at CMS. So we have data.cms.gov, data.medicare.gov, data.healthcare.gov, et cetera, et cetera. And so when the application itself doesn't have an API, we will put the data behind the application out on Socrata, and Socrata will produce those APIs that developers can use. So that's been a way we've tackled putting those things out there, even while in the background we might be working on a way to sort of natively provide an API from the app itself.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Real quick before I step away, are there any questions on the phone from anyone?
Silence. Okay, good. Thanks a lot, John. Appreciate it. So next, we have Elmo. Gloria and her team are going to come up and talk about, this is a good story, talking about legacy systems. We've taken it, I think I mentioned that earlier at the opening, how we've taken this legacy system and it's been transformed. And really, API seems to be the trend, right? That's where everybody wants us to get to versus exchanging files. So you'll hear more from them on that perspective.
Hi, like George said, I'm Gloria Stedding. I work for CMS and OIT, and I'm the PM for ELMO. So ELMO is the Eligibility and Enrollment Medicare Online, and it's not only an online system, but it also provides data services and the APIs, like John was talking about earlier. Okay, so today, oops. All right, so the presenters today will be myself, and Lakshmi is next to me. He has been key to the successful implementation of ELMO, and a few of the team members are here with him today. So he'll be presenting as well. So the agenda for today is what is ELMO? We'll be going over the system architecture, the ELMO data services, which is an API, the potential ELMO API consumers, and accessing the ELMO API. And this will also address the concerns that one of the gentlemen had about legacy systems. All right, so what is ELMO? So the stakeholders were responsible for naming ELMO. So we got them involved early in the process. So ELMO, like I said, is the Eligibility and Enrollment Medicare Online System. It's the unified user interface. It provides data services framework for the Medicare beneficiary, demographics, entitlement, eligibility, low income, health status utilization, and it not only displays information, but it provides the users the ability to do some updates as well. So ELMO integrates and modernizes functions and supported by the legacy user interfaces. And I know some people have heard them as MBD, GUI interface, or EDB. And these are the two applications that we're replacing and using ELMO. So years ago, we created the common Medicare environment known as the CME, so that houses all the data in one location. So the next logical step was to create a UI so that the users can go to one place to get the information. Because today they were going to the MBD for some information, going to EDB for some, and as well as MARCs. Okay. All right, the current scope. So ELMO is currently in production today, and it has been for over a year. And the left, whoops, sorry. All right, so on this screen, the current scope, the box on the PBS user interface, this is the EDB applications that uses Model 204 today. So the functionality for the BERT, ERNIE, the DIRT, Lockbox, and LBRS is all going to be incorporated into ELMO. And some of the BERT functions and the Medicare Easy Pay is already in production today in ELMO. And then the next box is the MBD SS user interface. This is known as the MBD GUI interface. It also houses like the Medicare demographics, Part A entitlement, very similar data to what the EDB has. So instead of going to two different places, go to one. And in the future, ELMO will have the functionality to bring in MARCs. So that way users don't have to log into ELMO and to log into MARCs. So it has the capability to bring in MARCs once the stakeholders agree that that's where they want to go. And as you see then underneath that, none of the back end has been changing. This is the legacy part. We're just changing the UI as to how the data is being presented. So the back end stays as is. Okay, ELMO, we did go through 508 compliant. In fact, they got 100% when they did their 508 testing. We completed a performance testing and were able to process over 100 transactions per second. In order to get to ELMO, you do have to create an EIDM user ID and then request the role on the portal. ELMO is role-based. And within ELMO, just a few key pointers. It does provide users with the ability to use MicroStrategy, and also the users have the capability to design and print from Elmo. So they have the ability to select what they would like to have printed and the functions to actually print the data. We currently have over 500 users in Elmo today, and that's growing. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to Lakshmi.
Thanks, Claudia. My name is Lakshmi Manambedu. I'll talk about the system architecture for Elmo. Basically, it was intended to be an UI framework to start with, but keeping up with modern development approaches, we have built a very rich API layer, which is what we're going to talk about primarily today. But we'll talk about the overall architecture before we get to the APIs themselves. So it's a three-zone architecture, like typically in CMS, and we go after the common Medicare environment, which is a combination of EDB, MBD, and MARCS data, and it's on the mainframe. And the front end itself is developed with Angular 4. It's a modern UI, and it uses REST API for all the data access. And basically, we have two types of services on the API, the business services and data services. The difference being data services are typically get operations, typical read-only operations, whereas business services do transactional operations as well. And one of the things of the business services also is that they very often go to a legacy business process on the mainframe. It's not that there are business processes that exist on the mainframe which touch external entities, and for example, the Medicare Easy Pay is one of the functions we have already implemented. So what it does is, what it supports is a Medicare beneficiary can choose to have their Part A and B premium withheld from their bank account. So they can send in a form to CMS contractor who puts in the information into the system. And there is a touch point to the US Treasury and a whole process that goes on, and the bank actually before the process starts. So that whole process already exists, and it's been working for maybe a couple of decades, maybe, I don't know. But we did not replace that part, but the UI part of it, we have a web-based UI for it, and it calls the existing services. I'll talk about a little more about adapters and so on that we use to connect to that. And so basically, the data services and the business service API, it's a REST-like API. I wouldn't call it classic REST because we have taken some liberties with the way we implement it for security. Typically, like the main difference being that we use POST for everything, like that may not be something classic REST architect would like. But otherwise, it's very much like it's HTTP-based and JSON and general concepts of REST API. And then for the data access itself, it uses JDBC for most of the operations. Wherever there are simple gets, it does go to the CME, MBD, or EDB databases directly on the mainframe and gets the data. Whereas for the business services, we have to create adapters for the type of service we are accessing. For example, right now we have an adapter for the EDB and another adapter for the MBD applications. So we need to go to the mainframe. We go through message queues using XML or JSON, any format, any payload is supported. Any of those two payloads could be supported. And they connect to CICS-based services on the mainframe to actually perform the transaction. So that concept could be extended to other systems too in the future. For example, if you're talking about, say, if you want to get claims information in the future, we could potentially go through a message queue, write an adapter to go to the CWF system to get access claims information in real time. And likewise, like Gloria mentioned before, we do have a lot of data from the MARCS system, but there are certain aspects which are transactional in nature, again, and MARCS like payment calculations and so on. If you want to access payment data, for example, we could go to the MARCS application rather than replicate that process within Elmo. So that's what I've shown as System 1, System 2. So we have options in terms of how we connect. We can go through message queues, or we could access them. If they expose a REST or SOAP-based API, we could consume those as part of Elmo. And at the bottom, you would see the MBR. Basically, that's a project we are currently on. We are trying to incorporate the SSA's MBR, the Master Beneficial Record System, into Elmo. SSA already has an API for it, both web-based as well as mainframe to mainframe connection. So we are exploring which would be the right way to do it. With this, what would happen is a user at CMS can not only look at the beneficiary record as it looks at CMS. If they are troubleshooting something, they can actually connect to the SSA system transparently and see how the beneficiary record looks at CMS, SSA to reconcile any issues and take corrective action. So that's a process we are working on. We are going to have it done by June 2018 is our target. That would be incorporated within Elmo as part of our next major release. And otherwise, the only thing I would like to say is this is a cross-platform application. As I said before, the front end is pretty modern. Then we have, right now we are hosted on ZLinux, the Java application for the APIs. And then we have the mainframe as the backend for the database as well as some business services. And other than that, it's the UI itself is hosted on the CMS portal using EIDM as for authentication and user provisioning. Then, having said that, since we have this API, rich collection of API, it does present opportunities for other systems to directly come into the API rather than using the UI for getting data. The first use case we have right now is with the next generation desktop, the call center application. They are in conversations with us on how they could directly tap into our API rather than their users logging into Elmo. They would otherwise log into Elmo to get certain functions. So with this approach, they could directly come in, like their application can connect to us. And we are currently working on a pilot with them. And that's slated to go live in January. It's going to production in January 2018. But we're getting a specific function at this point. I'll talk about it a little later. But it presents opportunities for them to use more of our services wherein they connect to other APIs on the mainframe in the current world. So the way we are providing that is, as I said before, our API is HTTP, JSON-based, almost REST-like. And we are going to expose it to start with using an XML gateway so that we can do some request validation and some first level of control security in terms of client certificates and user credential sharing, all that stuff. We're going to do that level. So we're going to use JSON Web Tokens for basically getting a user assertion from the partner systems so that they don't need to have a user ID within Elmo. It's a system-to-system connection. So that's the overall lay of the user system architecture. Obviously, there's more to it behind the scenes. This is a conceptual level, and as I said before, we'll focus more on the data services part of it today. We did a demo almost 6 months back of the UI itself, so we're not going to repeat that. So I think we're not too far. One previous. So I'll just summarize. It's an extensible framework, and it's initially intended for a UI, but it's evolved into a data services framework. And we can allow other systems to consume our services, and we are also capable of consuming services from other systems. The examples have been Medicare Easy Pay and the MBD functions. MBD has a whole lot of API functions already, like if there's a discrepancy between two systems at CMS, you can resync data, you can change beneficiaries Part D eligibility, recalculate it, and rescrub an address for like using the post office software. A whole bunch of stuff exists on the MBD process itself, so we are tapping into a lot of those. And it is, as I said before, good candidates in the near future in terms of us consuming services would be Marks and CWF. That's where we could get the most value if we could tap into those. And it's the UI also is, as I said, it's a modern UI with role-based as well as user-directed view customization. Basically, like we have 17 different roles with a lot of qualifiers within each role. And so basically, we have a lot of different types of users coming into the system. So we would automatically configure the user views based on the user's role, but also the user has the option of customizing the view by themselves too, based on what they can see. For example, if a user doesn't need certain types of information on the screen, they can basically hide it as a preference, or you can, those kind of things. Simple customization options, and they can set default landing pages within the application. Because when you find a Benny, like where do they want to go? Depending on their profile, they may need to go to a different place in the system than the default page. those kind of things are being done to improve the user productivity so that they don't search and every time land on a snapshot and then navigate again. They can do repetitive functions easily. And it is load balanced and horizontally scalable. As Gloria said, we have done a performance test. It was more like a benchmark to see where we stand. We didn't really push it. What we benchmarked was with the beneficiary quick search, which is the most complex service we have at this point. We went up to about 100 requests per second with that. And that should be more than sufficient for what we have projected for the next few years in terms of capacity to support our needs. The next slide, we have been through multiple SCAs. We have been FISMA compliant and HIPAA compliant too. And basically, we have done multiple SCAs at this point, full SCAs on 2 successive years for a set of reasons. And we have come through them well. And we went through a 508 testing earlier this year, and we went through without any findings in that. So, as I said, otherwise it has a role-based access control, which is configurable and extends the capabilities of EIDM, essentially. Like EIDM provides certain functions out of the box, but we had to go about and extend the capabilities to provide more fine-grained access control. So we'll talk about the future now. As I said before, the original intent was the UI, but our core requirement initially was to replace the legacy platforms for the UIs. We had some client-server-based UIs, we had some mainframe-based UIs, like running platforms like Model 204, which are obsolete and difficult to support at this point. So our roadmap is by June 2018, we would be able to replace all the legacy UIs. And as it is, we have completed the Medicare Easy Pay and the Medicare MBD user interfaces. Those are both live, and the MBD UI has already been shut down, actually, as of this month. We've shut it down. And the EDB UIs, we have made a partial transition, but the complete transition will happen in June. And by November of next year, we'll shut down the Model 204 platform, which is a pretty expensive licensing cost for CMS at this point, something like $250,000 a month or something like that. And the whole plan was that just shutting down Model 204 is going to pay for this project over a period of time. That is the premise on this whole project. And then we are also planning to expand the type of information that would be shown on this. The first thing is the MBI, basically the Medicare Beneficiary Identifier, which is going live across CMS in March, April next year. So the Elmo system would be ready to handle that at the point. It'll display and provide some functions like how to reassign an MBI and do some reporting on those things. And in future, we could potentially bring in additional information from the MARC system. Right now, we already have enrollment and premium related data, but payments and other types of transactions don't exist in Elmo at this point. So that could be an add-on to this project in future after June next year. And as I mentioned before, claims could be a good set of information to have on this. And other than that, apart from the UI process, as we went through this project, the data services seem to be more appealing. Like some of our partners want to talk to us about the data services we have. As I mentioned, we are talking to NGD about it. And what we would do with this is we would replace the legacy APIs on MBD and EDB. Both these systems do have real-time APIs for systems, other partner systems. Though these are mainframe applications, they do have APIs already in place. So Elmo would eventually replace those APIs to start with. And any other user interface at CMS could come in directly to Elmo rather than having users jump through multiple UIs. And we are also looking at providing customizable widgets of beneficiary views so that instead of the partner systems accessing our UIs, they could actually get a view, presentable view they can embed in their applications rather than formatting and those kind of things on their site. So that's something we are looking at too. Next, please. So talking about APIs, the top four, like we have some very specific APIs too for transactional processing, but the main APIs that anybody would use, any partner system would use, are looking up a Benny, finding information on the Benny, and so there are different flavors of that. If the partner system is looking up a Benny using one of the identifiers, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be the MBI, it could be the SSN, or HICN, Health Insurance Claim Number, or a Social Security number, any of those, and even RRB number. Any of those would be acceptable. If they present an ID, we can find the Benny. And when they find a Benny, they can also add on to that request, like in terms of what views, beneficiary views they would like to get as part of that. Right now, we have more than 70 plus beneficiary views. Like a view is typically like Part A entitlement history, or Part B entitlement history, enrollment history, premium details. Like those are all typically views. We call them views of information. So they can actually have a list. It's basically an a la carte kind of API. You have a core API, plus you can add on to it saying, in addition to finding a Benny, return these following information, so that they can save a round trip. They can do it in a single trip. So that's for a quick search, we call it. And the fetch details is another function. Basically, once they found a Benny, and they can incrementally request more information on a particular Benny. So that's add-on views. It's more efficient because you don't have to locate the Benny again. They already located the Benny. They just need additional information. Then the advanced search is in cases where you do not have an identifier. You're looking up a Benny based on other attributes like name, part of the SSN, like in addition to something else, and a contract. You want to get a list of beneficiaries for a given contract and so on. So the advanced search allows that to be done. And the list search is basically if you have a Finder file, or for example, right, you have a list of Bennies you want to deal with, 100 Bennies or 200 Bennies you want to work on, you can send the list, and we'll send the list of matching Bennies back. And there are a whole bunch of other things which are not for, we would not share with our partners. Those are mostly internal APIs, but there are specific exceptions like the one we talked about, the NGD case. They are an internal system. It's essentially, they can get access to some of the update transactions in Elmo. The next slide basically lists out the types of views we have. So we have categorized them as demographics, basically any identifiers like CAN, BIC, SSN, RRB number, and so on, and cross-reference history, and the MBI will be added soon. And then you have name, different types of mailing addresses exist for the Benny, like raw mailing address as well as the scrubbed ones, and birth rate, death rate, and so on. And other restricted information also like deportation history, if any, and not lawful presence, incarceration status. Then we have the entitlement group, the Part A and B entitlement group, where it's, you have the entitlement and Part D eligibility and any premium information on Part A and B, including IRMA. And if the Benny is direct billed or part of a third party enrollment, we have that information too. On the mark side, we have the enrollment segment for RX and opt-out information, RDS, and the premium information, premium-related information. There are various topics on the premium side. And then low-income subsidy also is available. And adding to that, we have health status information, ESRD, dialysis, transplant history, hospice, institutional status, and so on. And we also have Medicare secondary payer information. And MBD and EDB collect this data from a variety of other systems. So they're all accumulated in the common Medicare environment. So we have access to a database which has a rich collection of information short of claims, essentially. Claims information we don't have in the database, but we have everything else pretty much. And then we have the utilization information, which is basically a subset of claims information. MBD does receive some claims eligibility related information from CWF on a daily basis. So these are the data elements that are used by the HEDS system too. So we have views that provide those details too. So next, who are the candidates for the API? We have been doing some analysis as to who could potentially use these APIs from Elmo. As I mentioned, NGD is a pilot for us. They are using a function called resync from CME to CWF. So this is a situation when they notice that the data in CWF is out of sync with what is in CME. the call center rep basically requests the data to be transferred to CWF. So that's the function they're going to use first, so that their users don't have to log into Elmo to do that. And we are going to expand that. After this pilot, we're going to expand it to other APIs they already consume. NGD already consumes APIs within MBD and EDB, so they could transition out of those APIs and move to Elmo. And there has been some discussion on potentially offering this service to the Medicare appeal system, which connects to MBD right now through a kind of complicated mechanism. And there are other systems like DDPS and REMAS potentially could use these, but they are currently coming through a mainframe link, so we need to evaluate those. But MAS seems to be a good candidate. Other than that, there are a lot of partners who get daily data feeds from CMS. They could benefit by accessing data in real time from Elmo, like retiree drug subsidy system and COB. And the big one could be the Medicare Advantage and Part D plans. They do what is called the beneficiary eligibility query. It's the process that has to precede any enrollment for a beneficiary. You need to check the beneficiary's entitlement and eligibility history before they could actually put them on a plan. And the way they do it is they submit a file or a beneficiary, and CMS responds to them. And this happens several times a day. They typically send a file for a Benny. There's one record in a file, it comes to CMS and gets processed. It gets turned around in something like 10 to 15 minutes most of the time. But still, that's the case for a web service, and they could benefit from that. So that's something, it seems to be a low-hanging fruit and could add a lot of value. And then we have what is called the EDB Application Integration Facility. That's another API on the mainframe where several systems use, like including NGT, the REMIS system uses it, and SSA comes into it too at this point. SSA connects to the mainframe from their mainframe. So they could benefit from that too. So we are looking at all these potential partners, but right now focusing on NGD, and with that experience, we'll go forward to other partners. I will pretty much skip through the slide, except that it just shows the way you connect. The architecture, all that we are doing is for exposing the API, we are configuring the data-powered gateway to accept Elmo API requests and route it to our servers. It's pretty straightforward. It's going to be HTTPS, REST, JSON, will recover a client certificate, and JOT to complete the whole process. And slide 15 basically shows a typical structure of request. It's very straightforward. So if you recall from the previous slide, URL is typically /beneficiary something /something. And then you need to provide some function-specific parameters. If you're sending in the beneficiary identifier, you give it as part of that request, or a list of IDs, or some criteria. And there are some mandatory headers required. And we need a signed JSON Web Token. That's all I have on this. Any questions at this point?
Any questions, anybody? No? Hopefully you realize the value there is here in terms of the accessing all that information that it's been traditionally very hard to get to, or had all this legacy API surrounding it. And now we're trying to make it much more easily available. The other piece was the, copying the data. So this effort directly supports that, right? Instead of copying the data from one place to the next, which has been the traditional way of how CMS is operating, now getting access to the data directly, it's key. I mean, from a consolidation perspective, savings, cost savings, I mean, it's huge. So API is definitely the way the CMS is going more and more. At this point, let me open it up to the phone to see if there's any questions about Elmo.
If there are any questions at this time, please do so by using the raise hand feature, and your lines will be unmuted individually.
Silence. So, I mean, from your perspective, right, as a partner, as a CMS Fed, what does it really mean to you? It means that if you need the data, oh, is there a question? No, I think somebody's driving probably. But what does it really mean to you? Now you know where to get it. I mean, in terms of instead of just copying and duplicating the data. And that to me, that's where the power is. How much it simplifies so much of the work that you need to do because a lot of the complexities are already being handled by the Elmo platform, if you will. Well, I'd like to thank, yes?
I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So the question I have is there any type of latency or slowness based on the fact that, you're using the API that's going through multiple steps to get to the data? Is there any type of slowdown when you're doing heavy load type query?
The question has to do with latency for what I was able to gather.
So the API itself is, we are typically a sub-second response for all these requests. But the data, you may be aware that how data flows between SSA, CMS, and other entities, it's not real time at this point. They're all mostly batch feeds. So there could potentially be a delay of up to 24 hours. Like if you have something in CWF, for example, it may take almost 24 hours to get to MBD. So that kind of latency you would see. That is the reason that currently systems like even though they get a batch feed, for example, NGD has a full copy of the database, but there may be situations when their case representatives have to log into Elmo to see a more current version of the data because their data is going to be at least 24 hours behind MBD. So those kind of latencies would exist because of the overall architecture at CMS. But within Elmo, if the information is available in CME, there should not be any latency.
And I will add to that we are working on a separate track. How do we remove some of those latencies from a data perspective? Try to consolidate the data repositories that we have so it's more up to date. You go into the true source versus today we still have some, different pockets of copies of the data. So this is the platform is not solving that problem, but it's positioned CMS to get us at a better place. So, yes, there's a question in the room.
A simple question, Lakshmi. Any plans to use the previous discussion which was talking about the Kong API gateway? Any plans on using that API gateway as your gateway platform to make it more scalable?
We have not explored that yet, but our API, the data we expose is a lot more sensitive. None of these are public APIs. So we still need to look at whether there's going to be a CMS enterprise vision for how we expose APIs. These APIs are intended only for trusted partners. It's not for anybody outside, anybody who's not doing business with CMS directly. It's not intended for them because it gives direct access to beneficiary information.
Okay, I want to thank Lakshmi and Gloria. Thank you very much for the effort. And you guys can go. And then let me share with you, so next Tech Topic session is going to be November 7th, and it's going to be Microsoft Azure. That's the sole topic. So, CMS is at AWS today, and our strategy was to be fully integrated with it, meaning they are part of our WAN. We've done the same thing with Azure. Why? Because interoperability. Just like the APIs, we're trying to avoid redundancies, copies of things. So being highly integrated is the key. That's our sort of strategic move. So Azure will be here, the team, as well as the infrastructure team, to let you know what they've done. And we have the ATL, 0 findings, which is great. But I mean, the key is, how can you use it, right? Because I'm sure there's many of you out there, how can we get in line to begin using it and get on board? So that will be what the presentation will be on November 7th, all about Microsoft Azure. So it should be a good one. And then next is on December 7th, well, that's the CMS Emerging Edge Forum. And this is a research forum. This is what I'm getting more participation from companies and vendors where they're bringing ideas. One of the ideas that brought in the last time was about blockchain. What does it really mean to CMS? And they're not active projects, but the key is that any of you can participate, but it has to be research. It cannot be, I'm selling a product, research oriented. And I vet every presentation because I have an agreement with our contracts team to be sure that we're not providing, company X, a free marketing versus company, Y. And I really, for me, it's a venue to learn. What's out there, the art of the possible. The reason I had to go this morning is because, there's so many activities happening. We're trying to move the agency from our governance, from the activities of consolidating, moving towards API, consolidating data efforts. I mean, you saw John Booth here from, the Agile and some of the tools that he has. We're really trying to unify the agency, as we move forward and get all the IT leadership, CTOs across the agency, working with our CIO, and how do we move forward? There's many, many, many efforts. So I really take advantage because we're trying to share as much as we have with you. All this information is available in an internal SharePoint and also in Zone, which is our external repository. If you want to get access to Zone, you got to do a search on the hashtag CMS Converge, and the instructions will come out on how to get access to it. And that's where we're going to post this information. Again, my goal is to be as transparent. Why? Because I want you to know. Why do you need to know? So as you are seeing works that come out of CMS, you have the knowledge. So when we're doing your requisitions, proposals, hopefully this gives you insight to know what CMS is trying to do. And that will help you, and it helps us, really, the programs, to advance the CMS, the mission of the agency. Okay, without any other questions, I'll give you back 10 minutes, and I'll see you next month. Thanks.